Hello everybody, my name is Damien. Today I have a very special video planned. It's one that I've had in store for a while. I've been working on it, sort of writing and rewriting certain sections of it. I'm probably going to be re-recording a few bits of audio today as I'm finalizing the editing process. Just wanted to say really quickly that the channel is going to be more about stories in general and how they're told as well as my own. But, with that out of the way, I'd like to go ahead and start by focusing on, like I said, stories. Games particularly have a very interesting way that they can tell stories, given how important that player input is. So, my favorite storytellers are typically those associated with FromSoft Hiromu Arakawa from Fullmetal Alchemist fame, and, of course, Toby Fox. Not because the stories are super complex in Toby's games, but because the methods through which the deeper ideas and concepts are presented. Toby, as of late, has been primarily working on a game called DELTARUNE. It's episodic, meaning the chapters of the story and gameplay are released separately from each other over time. The game's full release will contain chapters 3 through 5, and 6 and 7 coming as free updates. Chapters 1 and 2 have been released for free over the span of 3 years, and Chapter 2 is the particular section of the story I will be focusing on. In DELTARUNE, the primary chunk of gameplay thus far has taken place within locations called Dark Worlds. These worlds are basically realms of fiction generated from the emotions and memories of a Lightner that opened the Dark World's fountain by piercing the ground with a blade while experiencing some extreme form of will or emotion. So, quick bit of vocabulary for those uninitiated. A Lightner is an individual from reality, as we would see it. They are the ones capable of opening and closing dark fountains. Thusly, denizens of the Dark World are Darkners. Closing a dark fountain basically turns all of its citizens back into inanimate objects. Dark fountains are essentially sources of reality for the Darkners in this regard. The purpose of closing these fountains is to prevent a veritable apocalypse, known as the Roaring, in which titans will rise up and lay waste to both light and dark worlds. There is one dark fountain being held open purposefully by the main characters, and this acts as a bit of a traditional RPG hub town to buy supplies for the main gameplay portion of the experience. The second dark fountain, after that one, to be opened, leads to a metropolis known as Cyber City. It's a love letter to internet culture over years and technology in general, laden with memes and reinterpretations, but typically in subtle ways with niche references, say from Minecraft. Many people turn to the internet when they're lonely or want to feel as if they have a voice, like Noelle Holiday. More than likely, the Dark World was influenced heavily by her presence, as pointed out by Mystic Slime in his video titled Essence Theory. That being said, it's clear that people seek companionship even online. People can get very, very lonely, with a deep, aching despair like a hole in the chest. While dangerous, it can be ignited, leading to explosive action like an animal thrashing about to do anything other than die. Sometimes this drives people to recover and improve. Other times, people never really get any form of support. Ever. And while not all cases are like this, I feel that the individual this video is focused on embodies this and many other dreads very, very well. This little gremlin is Spamton. Before he even jumps out of the dumpster, we can see a torn poster of Queen, revealing an older poster of Spamton's face. Queen is the main antagonist of the chapter, but I've less to say on her as others have made videos focused on the topic, like Universal Mother by Kooky Autumn. Spamton is an optional side path in both the normal and weird route, starting with the normal route. Spamton is the embodiment of spam email and presents himself as a washed-up salesman. According to him, he actually topped the charts of Cyber City in 1997, a year he often refers to as his favorite. And while most of the circumstances he seems to be ascribing to you seem to apply to himself as well, the particular line of "friends abandoned you for the slime you are," it's probably projection as well as the rest of it, and representative of a very negative self-image, as well as potentially a bit of a abandonment issues. Not only that, he seems to be aware of this dummy-esque appearance partially given the mouth lines and the movement in more detailed sprites. Which reminds me, keep that award-losing smile in mind. He even makes reference to the method of controlling puppets by telling Chris they just gotta grab life by the silly strings. Typically, one would imply something far more daunting and confrontational like horns, but this subtlety is important. This allusion to reaching for the things that control and the connections we have to them. Importantly, Spamton and Chris resemble each other in their story arcs, as Chris, the avatar for the player, doesn't actually fully stand in for the player, and actually acts on their own fairly often, or states things in a certain way. In that way, one can consider the control the player has over Chris to be very much unfavorable to Chris, given the responses throughout, such as tearing their own soul, or potentially the player's soul, from their body and throwing it into a cage in Chapter 1's end. Already, Spamton is revealing he's in the know, and very much deeply so. Several times Spamton makes reference to becoming a big shot. I consider this to be one who is akin to a god, able to act upon everything without ever having to be affected by anything, with strings being representative of the connections one has not only to one controlling them, as it were, but the people around them as well, like the ones that they surround themselves with. This symbolism will be highlighted more as we go, so keep it in mind. Spamton wants to fight us even without a response from Chris, as he wants us to show off our light, probably to confirm we are what he is seeking. There's the award-losing smile line I was talking about. Notice how it hasn't gone away save for the sales going down the drain and garbage can dialogue lines? It feels very artificial given the insane and clearly disgruntled ramblings he's constantly spouting off, either emphasizing a very real and tangible insanity, or a very much plastic facade, perhaps both. Spamton is single-minded in his desire to make deals, as he says it's actually the main reason he went into the business of sales, as he likes getting to cut his own deals, make his own choices. Spamton is clearly insecure in this regard and many others, as he constantly pushes you to see things from his angle and help him become a big shot, so he can help you out later, since you two are so alike. At least, that is what I got from the dialogue. In reality, Spamton is manipulating you to empower him greatly with little reward for Chris, though this will become clearer later. Just as well, throughout the battle, Spamton seems to occasionally talk over the typical narration text, showing that manipulation is already running deep within the current situation. Spamton implies he wants to become something more significant than the supposed primary antagonist, the roaring knight that desires to bring about their namesake, the previously discussed roaring. Spamton has many references to a boss from Chapter 1, Jevil. Jevil was a secret, hidden-away superboss that was the court jester for the four kings of the Card Kingdom. However, one day, in his desire to play games with a worthy opponent, he met a very strange someone, and his demeanor changed. He became destructive, malicious, reveling in chaos and babbling a bunch of nonsense that both made no sense and just a little bit. His best friend eventually sealed him away in an area that appears to be, for all intents and purposes, outside of the boundaries of the game. Remember how earlier I put quotes on reality? This and information from the Spamton sweepstakes events, which is getting its own video, it's slowly becoming clear that the world of Deltarune is, diegetically speaking, both a video game and its own reality. That is to say, within its own reality, it is a video game. The fact that it is a video game is diegetic to the story. Characters such as Spamton and Jevil are aware of things like HP and being trapped inside, when Jevil is the one that seemed to be sealed away in a jail cell, unless he was actually instead sealed outside of reality. Especially if you look at the edge of the cage where he is being held within, quote-unquote, it doesn't actually appear to be any sort of room, it's just sort of bars, and the pathway that leads up to it just drops off. After accepting Spamton's deal, which he lies to us after a certain dialogue point of no return that he can't force us to take, he asks us to visit his lovely shop, which is in the garbage zone. Fitting, but depressing given his obviously overhyped description of the locale, And upon entering, he just feels kinda sick, doesn't he? This whole area and the phone in the background ringing in time with the music, it feels like such a desperate attempt to seem like anything desirable or anything at all. I was filled with pity immediately when I first entered, and it kind of made my heart sink a little, I won't lie. It felt like it hit a little too close to home, like seeing someone you know just declining. The dude tried to scam me endlessly, and yet I could still feel myself in a very similar situation easily. His prices are randomly generated, and every item is actually awful, either unusable or actively dangerous. His dialogue, however, reveals much more. He probably shrunken the acid that's in Queen's mansion, given her statement that that's how she shrunk the little houses in the swan boat section, and how she thinks Chris and Ralsei should shrink themselves to go in the houses. They never do that. Just as well as the "it burns" lines, and the other lines regarding to swimming in burning acid while we soak in the hyperlink blocked. This more than likely occurred sometime during his stay in the mansion. He also probably had friends at one point, given that one of the few times, I think like literally 3 or 4, that he stopped smiling is him simply asking, "Friends?" Clearly, Spamton misses Mike, the individual referenced later in the same dialogue tree, given information from the sweepstakes that implies that the subsequent "the man's a criminal" line is actually about an entirely separate entity. Spamton tries to tell Chris something about the night, but then gets cut off by either himself or whatever secondary force is driving him, just like the soul in Chris. They seem to be pleading for help, and to reference once again to the diegesis of the game as a game in its own reality. It pulls unused text from Chapter 1, which was implemented here and only here. Not only that, there is a new, as of Chapter 2, set of unused text that seems to continue the scenario, emphasizing the idea that Spamton has ties to things outside of the reality of Deltarune, which is simultaneously glitched and unused content. At least that's usually how it's depicted, or hinted towards in the case of some of the sweepstakes stuff. Chris and Spamton know each other, as in many regards they have the same experience. The difference being Chris, or at least the player, desires to help Spamton regardless of what we get in the end, simply because we like him. Spamton, however, always needs an ends. He doesn't see the capacity for the genuine give and take between people and others, and instead chooses to manipulate people into doing some things that they would do anyways, and also a few things they wouldn't. Remember that deal he kept pushing on us? Turns out it's for a new body. Probably just for Spamton, being the one-sided reward of this joint venture. It's hidden deep in Queen's basement, and in the third instance of Spamton not smiling, he simply states we won't get inside, until he then gives us a keygen to bypass the encryption. It basically a program to guess the password so that they can get in, as a commemorative ring, and asks us to retrieve the empty disk within the body. Once we have retrieved it from the basement area, which makes reference to more things revealed in the Spamton sweepstakes, retrieve the disk and return to Spamton, he then asks us to install him into the disk, and then to insert the disk back into the new body. And when we do, Spamton does nothing, and the body doesn't react until we go to leave the area. Suddenly he drops down, preventing us from doing so, surprising us. He has a massive and slightly angelic body, but now bright green strings are clearly present. Spamton doesn't feel big enough to finally grow past the need for strings, and states that it's still dark, so dark. This may refer to his reality, but potentially more to his general outlook on life and his feelings on the future in general, given that he cannot be rid of that which brings him the most agony in his eyes, which, given his existence as a puppet, is also what gives him the ability to act upon the world, and to be influenced by things in the world. But he doesn't want those strings. He potentially doesn't want to exist in that case. I may be reaching too far here with the symbolism, as he doesn't seem to recognize this later, but we'll get to that. Otherwise, he wants to be free of the restrictions and the influence of forces that are not himself, while still being able to act freely upon all other things and people. I consider this to be the simplest definition of a god, if you will. One whose will is entirely present and whose influence cannot be quashed or even greatly affected. The idea of godhood is supported more by Spamton's desire to see heaven, as he calls it, which is either the light world or, again, this sort of godly power or state. However, he seems to need a human soul. So far in Undertale and Deltarune, it would appear that the human souls are the greatest catalyst for change, especially through burning and unwavering desire referenced in Undertale as determination. In a way that this reflects reality, at least in theory. Those who truly desire something most are the most likely to achieve it, as they will be driven to understand as much as possible about their goal and how to go about it, as opposed to one who tries for something when it is convenient or through singular means. In Undertale, in a way, monsters stand in for fictional characters as a whole and potentially other groups that oneself does not share many similarities with. So, the upcoming points are kind of a philosophy thing and kind of a storytelling thing. Consider a hypothetical. A set of circumstances that, for all intents and purposes, does not exist in reality, but one considers the application of logic in an otherwise illogical or tough setting. In that way, we mentally simulate the events therein. Immersing oneself in any form of media is very similar, requiring suspension of disbelief, yes, but otherwise acting as if it were its own world. It isn't, in any literal sense, and yet one could still consider it its own reality, especially if one deems it so. Well, yes, this also describes delusion, belief in a provable non-reality. It has more to do with the ideas expressed through the butterfly dream fable, wherein Zhangzi states that he dreamt that he was a butterfly once, and while dreaming, for all intents and purposes, he was and always was a butterfly. But when he awoke, it was suddenly unreality. The talking point is that once one defines reality, it can become harder and harder to definitely prove that we are within reality, specifically. It's kind of paradoxical and inverse of how we typically come to better understand and define things. So with that little preface for where this is coming from, I think that Deltarune is about the idea that games, movies, books, really any story is a self-contained universe and reality separate of all others, including its authors. Following this logic, the light world acts as a stand-in for our world, with the dark worlds standing in for the stories and fiction as a whole. Suddenly, the whole balance of light and dark and the dark fountains causing an apocalypse if too many are open makes far more sense, too many people delving too deep into fantasy, or alternatively, people trying to bring about fantasies to reality without any sort of iteration for the potential consequences. Just as much, darkners are affected by the ongoings of lightners, and when lightners allow themselves to perceive darkners, they too are influenced by the darkners. In that way, it's sort of how, when someone writes a character, they are influenced by the people around them to write that character, and when someone else reads about their character, they are influenced by that character. So then, what Spamton is to Chris is simultaneously what Spamton is to us on a surface level, a fictional character. If my current perception, the reality of fiction, is the actual theme of Deltarune, then Spamton is only a singular layer of fictional. However, if I'm incorrect, and this doesn't end up being like the actual case in the games, and dark worlds are just sort of like just fiction even in the world of Deltarune, then Spamton would be a fictional character, which even then could portray to Chris their exact scenario, having a fictional character interact with them and represent them almost fully. It's terrifying. Which even then could portray to Chris their exact scenario, making the symbolism of the character neutral entirely on this point, as far as I can tell. Even the creation of a dark world doesn't clarify much here, as far as we know, they have full histories from before they came into existence. Another point of evidence for them being representation of fiction as a whole, a book is published over the course of weeks, we'll say, but can have entire eons recorded within it. Just as likely, these dark worlds could exist before their fountains open, and are simply connected or reconnected. Not even the movement from dark world to dark world by darkeners requiring lighteners, nor the limitations therein, makes this any clearer for me either, as the light world could also simply act as a massive hub for other non-realities. Also, yes, I know Ralsei can seemingly move between dark worlds without Chris having to move anything related to Ralsei. I don't really know what that's all about yet. This battle is where a lot of the metaphysics becomes more clear to me. You see, both Jevil and Spamton seek freedom, but what is true freedom? My personal definition was honestly mostly adapted from the freedom scene of Neon Genesis Evangelion, specifically the anime series' ending, not the end of Evangelion, and the understanding of the self as something that necessitates the existence of others to perceive oneself, as well as to be perceived by oneself, which creates something different from the self, and therefore a way that one can distinguish the self from all other things around them. In other words, to define the self. Freedom, true freedom, is the removal of any and all restrictions or outside influences, which typically results in nothing but a void. We need gravity and a solid ground to exist for a place to be a place and not just a floaty abyss. But that limits us by locking all vertical movement to eventually lead into the direction of gravity. It's a sort of decision of one's fate by the environment around them. Just as much, there being a ground limits the existence or non-existence of the things where the ground lay. Jevil wants us to be free, or to see the freedom. And Spamton himself wants to be free at any price. In both battles, the air crackles with freedom, which I imagine to sound like DBZ distant shockwave sounds mixed with either electrical pops or like oil or firework pops and cracks. These details have led people to call this the freedom motif of the soundtrack. Spamton's battles, though, are unique in that both the fact that they have a shoot-'em-up gameplay style making reference to Metaton EX, a boss from Undertale, and that it actually includes lyrics. Lots of notifications that it's your chance to be a big shot, as well as some odd references to phones, strings that ring when pulled, and someone coming for Spamton assuming he's the one singing. More than likely, the individual influencing Spamton first reached him through the phone, given the one in his store and the phone ringing included in his themes, and his 2 or 3 phone-based attacks. Spamton's fight, also like Jevil's, at least in this read of the story, takes place in a location that seems, again for all intents and purposes, outside of reality of the dark world that they were put in, this time by riding carts into what appears to be a black abyss, and then a strange endless hell I call Spamton Land. Because of the carts and the buildings and the background and the only other person there all looking similar. Several times, there will be references to idiosyncrasies and impossibilities in the text, such as the air smelling of rotten glass and Spamton smiling and begging to the audience not to steal his furniture, even though the very next flavor text dialogue after that states that, very plainly, there is no audience. So far, these secret bosses toe the line between geniuses and madmen, which is the most uncomfortable version of the insane character trope in my personal opinion, as the archetype desires to uproot understandings of basic rules of reality. Either Spamton sees us and our audiences, or he's really just lost it. Even now, after threatening to kill us because we either are or can use big shots, which is to say, a person who has the ability to, or just the ability to, make decisions that denies fated paths, like being able to double jump like in video games, in reality, would be a pretty big shot move in this case. Or, in other words, denying the effect of gravity, which typically forces the destiny of all things constantly downwards to its source, even if only momentarily, by completely ignoring it and jumping once more off of nothing. Chris, instead, overcomes a literally impossible-to-dodge attack by doing something that, for all intents and purposes, we have no reason to believe Chris is capable of doing other than in these fights. This makes Spamton jealous and serves as a secondary motive for his malice. The fight can be brought to an end in one of two ways: defending him with violence or cutting his strings. Violence gets a generic "mwahaha, can't beat me if I power up" kind of dialogue before a catastrophic failure, but more interesting and pertinent to this discussion is the cutting of the strings, as Spamton comes to realize you did this because you want to help him. He wanted to be free of his strings, and maybe doing this will calm him down. He seems to acknowledge you as a friend, genuinely, and when you snap the final string, the cheesy music cuts out, and so do all the wacky visuals, and Spamton falls to the ground lifeless, and in the fourth instance of not smiling. When we can see again, he is suspended by these wires, even more so. His all-caps dialogue has been replaced with what a reasonable, sane person usually talks like in these worlds, as he acknowledges he could never be anything more than a puppet, either acknowledging the impossibility of his goal or recognizing that he gave the individual controlling him exactly what they wanted. But he desires to genuinely help the party as they tried to do with him. When leaving, Chris can admit to their friend Susie that the experience shook them, and they yell it if you choose the corresponding dialogue option. Chris can't always exert their will or express themselves without the player allowing them. In this way, Chris doesn't really have a say in how they act at all, even if they get to choose the way they say and do what we command, like saying "I'm fine" in a really strained way, or confusedly stating "Susie?" if you choose her as the dialogue option for Chris's potential crush, which isn't the case for the other options. If we return to the trash zone, the Addisons, embodiments of ads, will be lined up but facing away. Turns out Spamton used to be part of their crowd, but he never had any luck with their sales ever, and they just sort of pitied him and seemingly made fun of him directly or indirectly for his drive to become a big shot without any real progress. One day, he started getting calls, and suddenly deals were being made with him left and right, and his ranking shot up to number 1 in Cyber City. He abandoned these friends, making his response to the corresponding dialogue and his shop make far more sense, to live in the mansion, so they stopped acknowledging him altogether out of spite. But then, the calls stopped coming, and Spamton was eventually evicted as his sales went down the drain, as he says. From there, he was homeless and alone, and without any way of expressing his experiences in the only way he knew how: deals. Suddenly, the desperation, the phones, the strings, and chords all come together and it sort of clicks, but not entirely. It's clear that Spamton has the capacity for evil, and in the weird route, we exploit Chris's timid classmate, Noelle, who I mentioned earlier, into becoming quote-unquote stronger by freezing every citizen of Cyber City alive, egged on and tallies kept by Spamton, hiding in dumpsters out of sight. I won't cover all of Weird Route, as it mostly has to do with Chris and Noelle, but Spamton eventually sells you a ring of thorns you force Noelle to use to potentially kill your classmate, Birdley. This happens at the end of the Weird Route. Once you get to Queen's Mansion, even further towards the end, Spamton has taken it over entirely, and feels betrayed by Chris when they try to seal up the fountain. And just as Ralsei moved out of bounds for Susie to ask Chris if they were okay in the normal route, Chris and Spamton fight out of bounds and off of the platform or pathway to the fountain. The battle is much the same here, but ended by Spamton once again trying to force an unwinnable situation with an impenetrable defense, and a constant barrage of weak but still damaging attacks, until Chris, after calling for help and no one coming, is instead replaced with the player whispering Noelle's name, and she freezes the salesman to death. The thorn ring could carry symbolism of the crown of thorns, given that the roaring may also be referred to as the angel's heaven, if it is referring to the roaring in the introduction legend, unless this is a separate area or event entirely. However, some sort of apocalypse related to an angel is very much implied to be coming, with the whole Noelle being referenced to as an angel by an Addison, her dreams of jumping out of the Ferris wheel and spreading wings to fly away like an angel, again, the banishing of the angel's heaven, her white robes, gentle demeanor, very much a religious bit of iconography, and if there is imagery in there reminiscent of that, I imagine it has more to do with like a sort of, as I mentioned, rule of cool, sort of like the Christianity themes in Neon Genesis Evangelion. The Thorn Ring damages Noelle, gives her access to her most powerful spell by putting her in a trance, which gives the alternate name for the weird root, snowgrave. It should be considered that so far this is the only actual ring Spamton gives us as a commemorative ring, which means he either initially intended to guide you down this path, is just alluding to class rings and the like often being a bit egoist and a scam, or simply views the keys to progressing towards his goals as trinkets to be remembered just as much as powerful tools and weapons, which could be read as a twisted form of gift-giving, highlighting Spamton's desperation for companionship being just as intense as his desire to stop ever having such a need for it in the first place. Spamton is lonely and confused about life and how people treat each other, and reflects Chris in a great many ways, and honestly, I think Spamton works phenomenally as an abstracted but still somewhat realistic feeling, very much sick individual. With no real concept of how people want to be treated or how people actually treat each other, etc., etc., Spamton has little hopes of finding companionship at this point in his life, given circumstances partially in his control in the case of the Addisons, who seemed like shitty friends anyways, and very much conditional love of the rest of Cyber City. This is especially true when considering the Addisons appearing after his defeat in the normal route fight. Especially since, outside of the Addisons, only the Queen's butler, Swatch, seems to know anything concrete about Spamton. Either he hides, or nobody knows, or maybe both. All in all, if Spamton reminds you of anyone, check on them. Especially if it's yourself. Hell, this whole script came about because my whole realization that I kind of felt like I was in a similar situation, not nearly as intense or homeless, but it's still very much similar sentiment, and from what I can tell, there's a lot of other people that feel that just as well, and I feel like this character kind of deserves a spotlight for that. I've kind of had this on the back burner for a while, if you couldn't tell, and more content should be coming soon, this time hopefully within a week or two. Like if you liked, dislike if you didn't, and I wish YouTube still displayed dislike ratios. Share if you think I had anything interesting to say, or if you have a friend that you think might find what I have to say to be interesting. And thank you so much for your time. I understand it's a bit jarring to see such a long-form video out of nowhere from me, but honestly, this kind of script writing is sort of the thing I love, and the kind of analysis I love, outside of psychology, of course.